Smoak, Paul Catalina, and Craig Smoak.
Ralph Russo, Associated Press, college football writer since 2005. He goes, I like to tweet about the Mets, sports in general, but college football butters my bread. Is your bread, is garlic bread good to you, Ralph? You like garlic bread?
Oh, I mean, Russo, Italian. I mean, this is, come on. Of course, Italian. Of course, garlic bread is an essential food. It's like it should be part of most meals. If you're going to have bread, you might as well slap some butter and garlic on there.
Does the Big 12 have any garlic left on their bread?
I think what was interesting, the one somewhat interesting thing about today's dueling statements. Oklahoma and Texas putting out theirs, and then the Big 12 coming back later on with theirs. It within the Big 12 statement, within Bob Bowlesby's statement, there was a not so subtle acknowledgement that they're gone. Now, we may have known that, but I think within the Big 12, I had heard through talking to some folks that this idea of like, hey, listen, they're not going anywhere immediately. Maybe there's some time for us to change their minds. And they did get the meeting over the weekend with the president, so it sounds like they did. The Big 12 did all the talking. But I think the one thing I came out of today is this is not. There doesn't seem to be any going back now. This seems to be just a matter of when will Texas and OU leave.
Ralph, do you think it's more realistic that these 8 stay together, or that they just mercy kill this thing and move on?
So that's an interesting question because there's a lot of different scenarios. I'll try to be as brief as possible. If you're asking me to pick one, like there's a whole bunch of different scenarios. I think the most likely scenario is the 8 stay together. I think it for a couple of reasons. I don't think, and listen, I know I'm on a Waco, Texas station, so send your emails if you want. I don't think that the 8 have a ton of value on their own. Like singularly, so that there's gonna be more other conferences, bigger conferences with stability. Because if you're gonna move now, you're gonna want to go to a more stable situation. I don't know if if like the Big Ten and the Pac-12 and the ACC are looking at these 8 and saying, yeah, they bring value. They can up not only they up our numbers, but they also up our value. Maybe I can see some scenarios, but I don't think they're going to get picked apart more. And if they're not picked apart more, then there's strength in numbers. I think the Big 12 goes away if it just gets picked apart. But if the 8 of them stay together, now all of a sudden they have some power to wield. And the power that they have to wield is there's 4 years of contracts here with the college football playoff that says they get $67 million a year, the Big 12, with the Sugar Bowl that says you get $80 million a year in the Big 12. And with Fox and ESPN, who have a clause, I've been told, that is like that if there's a substantial membership change, there could be some, grab back as far as some money. But there's a lot of money flowing into the Big 12 right now that a lot of schools would like to be part of, even if it's only temporary. Not to mention, you're going to have a windfall. I don't know what the size of the check Texas and Oklahoma are going to have to write. But again, if you're Houston or UCF or Boise State, like you're looking at that going like, I'll take a piece of that for 4 years. We may not have that in year 5. Come 2026, it might be a very different world, but we can pad our coffers for 4 or 5 years under the Big 12 header. Not to mention one other thing, you also have autonomy. Like you have a voice in that autonomy process within the NCAA.
Yeah, I was reading actually a piece from CBS Sports. It said that the TV contract with ESPN and Fox contains languages that allows the Big 12 to reduce payouts and a loss of membership. That says the Big 12 could drop from $37 million in annual revenue to as low as $9 million per school with the losses of Texas and Oklahoma. Ralph, what are your thoughts on just this move by UT and OU in general? Obviously out of nowhere until the Brent Zwerneman report, and would have been just today, probably just would have been announced if not for that report. What are your thoughts on that move by those two schools?
So I think, in talking with more and more people, I'm starting to get an idea of what's happening here. And so listen, it's all about money, right? To a certain degree, it's always money's always going to be a big deal. And right now, the SEC is going to, even this year, the SEC paid out, I think, about $10 million more than the Big 12, and that number is going to continue to grow because the SEC's got, it was going to continue to grow, even the gap, even with Texas and Oklahoma at state. So there's that part. I think there is a part of it that is, and I reflect back to a conversation I had with Chris Del Conte a few years back. I think he had just moved to Texas from TCU. And when I was talking to him about non-conference scheduling, like, what's your philosophy on non-conference schedule? And he said, we want to schedule our peers. We want to be able to play at and bring in schools that are our peer conferences, big brands. And as I was sort of reporting things out today, and I started talking to people who are saying things like, listen, I think Texas, they liked the idea of Auburn and Alabama and LSU on their schedule and A&M again on their schedule, as opposed to what they were putting on their home schedules in the Big 12. And I reflected back to CDC having that conversation and basically saying like, oh, that wasn't just his non-conference schedule. He wanted that to be his entire schedule. That idea of Texas views itself as the peers of Texas. The schools that are more like Texas are these SEC schools. And I think to a certain degree, Oklahoma does too. Like, the interesting thing is Texas is getting all the blowback and they are the villain in this whole story, or it certainly seems that way. And it's really shielded Oklahoma from sort of any responsibility here. Like, Oklahoma is not just a wallflower here. I'm not asking you to throw shade at either one of them. You can do whatever you want. But it's amazing to me how Texas has just taken all the arrows here, and Oklahoma is sort of standing behind it as if like Oklahoma was taken hostage by Texas. So yeah, I think those are the reasons why I think that those schools. I think they also see the future of of college football as being affiliated with the SEC. I imagine they are very tired of hearing recruits tell them, "I want to play in the SEC." Right? I don't want to play in the Big 12. I want to play in the SEC. So it doesn't matter how good your school is. I want to play in the SEC.
You know, I tell you, there's another part of this equation that doesn't get much heat, although I think fans are smart enough to realize you can point the finger at Texas. You can point the finger at their new best friend in Oklahoma. But ESPN had to ramrod this back months ago. They knew this was coming. That's why they also told the Big 12, right, Ralph, that they weren't going to extend the rights anytime soon. And they own the rights to the SEC network. They own the rights to most of the Big 12. Fox has some too. They own the Longhorn network. What am I missing here that they may have had as much to do with this with anybody, as anybody?
So here's what I would say. Do I think ESPN is not somewhere involved in this whole thing, and that ESPN being a partner in this to the SEC and ESPN looking at this? In other words, I don't think ESPN is orchestrating these things, but I do think what happens with ESPN is you come to them, the SEC comes to them with a plan. Hey, what do you think about this? What do you think if we did that? And ESPN says, oh, that looks good. That's a good thing. Like, that's a good thing for us. We're not going to help you do it. We don't really have to help you do it, but we're certainly thinking that works for us in many ways. Mm-hmm. And the Big Ten, right? So I tend to be a little less about blaming ESPN, but the fact that they own so much of college football, that the college football world sort of revolves around ESPN, does make it a little harder for them to extricate themselves from these positions, right? They control the keys to a lot of what goes on here because they are paying so much money in ownership rights and rights fees. So again, like I said, I don't know if I'm about blaming ESPN for this, but ESPN sort of has to give like a nod to some of these plans, and it doesn't. And it would be hard to argue that this doesn't help ESPN because they want to make the SEC the focal point of they own the entire SEC, and now the SEC is better. So of course it helps ESPN.
Was there anything?
By the way, a lot of people on our YouTube chat room are agreeing with the ESPN part of this as well. Go ahead, Paul. Sorry.
Was there anything really, just looking back, was there anything the Big 12, the other 8 teams could have done to really stop this in the last 4 or 5 years?
I honestly don't think so. I mean, you can do unequal revenue sharing, but again, I don't even know if it's all about it. Listen, it's about the money, but is it just about the money? In other words, if cutting them in a little more, like, what does that do to the imbalance of that's not a real solution. I understand that those things were sort of on the table. How do we keep Texas and Oklahoma? And it's been reported here and there that, I'd even heard it too, like, well, we'll give them a little more money. But what does that do to your conference? Like, is that a conference worth having if now you're giving Texas and Oklahoma a lot more? I don't see it, because I don't see value in who else you could have brought on. You could say, well, 5 years ago when they tried to expand, maybe they should have done that. And having UCF and Cincinnati was going to change their minds, right? It was going to change Texas and Oklahoma's mind, but because they were now playing UCF and Cincinnati. So I don't know if I think maybe this was inevitable. I think the thing that I always felt would hold Texas and Oklahoma back. I always thought this more from Oklahoma's standpoint, but it makes sense for Texas too, was the idea of being the big dog, right? Oklahoma is not going to the SEC and winning 6 straight titles. It's just not. I'm not saying Oklahoma is going to become, Ole Miss or Mississippi State, but they're not winning 6 straight. Oklahoma's brand is trophies. They're not winning as much in the SEC. They're giving that up. And Texas, listen, on the field, they haven't been all that great, but they still hold a lot of sway, and they still are aspirationally the highest ceiling program within the Big 12. So again, I always thought giving some of that up was the potential of giving that up, giving up big dog status was the thing that would hold Texas and Oklahoma in the Big 12, or at least give them pause about leaving. But they certainly showed that, nope, we're fine with that, with being a little smaller fish in a bigger pond. We're going to go head over here and play SEC ball.
So, Ralph, I've been saying since last week, I don't blame OU and Texas for the reasons you just mentioned, just the security, the money, the name, all that. It makes sense for them. But as somebody who's covered college football a really long time, and you're seeing all these changes happening, I think we all agree that NIL was something that was, that needed to happen. I mean, that was just right for that to happen. But seeing everything swirling and now seeing a move like this, what do you think about the future of college football? And we know it's going to look different, but how different do you think this is starting to become from, the sport that people grew up watching and falling in love with?
Yeah, I mean, some of the changes I've liked, right? I think NIL was some of the things that kind of had to happen because it was just getting harder legally to make a case for against it. I like the idea of a bigger playoff, though. I mean, listen, in retrospect, a bigger playoff is what also helped this, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you're Texas, just as I said before, if you're OU, you're not winning 6 straight SEC titles, but now you don't have to make the playoff, right? Because there are more paths. It might be a tougher path, but there are more of them to get you in there. So some of the changes I think have been positive. This one, I don't know. This one feels like Kevin Durant going to the Warriors, right? It was do we need this much power? Especially for me, guys, you don't care that much about my background, but I grew up in New York. I'm not an affiliation to any of these conferences. I love college football. I was a Queens kid who grew up loving all of college football from coast to coast. So the sport is sort of becoming like the power base of this sport, sort of centralizing down in SEC country, and the SEC gets bigger to the point where, is that just college football? In other words, is the SEC now become college football? Any restructuring is sort of restructured around the SEC. So I don't necessarily love that. And I bring up the Durant thing because, again, you looked at it and you thought wow, do you really have to go there? Does that team need to get much stronger? It seems like that is not great for the rest of the league. But I also found myself thinking but watching Kevin Durant, play with Steph Curry, play with Draymond. Like, that could be really fun to watch. Like, I'm interested to see what that looks like and how they tear people apart. So, listen, I'm interested to see Oklahoma and Alabama play every couple of years. I'm interested to see Texas and LSU play every couple of years, and Texas and Florida. It will be interesting to watch, but I am not sure it's good for college football at large.
Yeah, Texas and LSU they owe each other one, right? Because they played the game in Austin the year that they had Burrow, and that was a hell of a game. I mean, that thing was kind of on fire until a third or fourth down conversion. So they owe each other one. I love college football, and I love the big matchups. It's changing, though. It is absolutely changing right in front of our eyes. Ralph, thank you for your time. Good luck. And enjoy whatever you have, because I'm sure every day there's something new you got to cover as well, like we do.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Good luck to you.
Thank you. This is from, I had this sent to me